As I've just said, my name is David Crowther. I'm going to talk a little bit about sexual violence, sexual abuse, and most importantly, the health that is out there. Every year, 750,000 people over 16 suffer from sexual violence or sexual abuse, sexual assault, or are raped. It's quite a startling number, 750,000 people, and that's every year. And that's only people over 16. If we're bringing in people under 16, that number rises dramatically. So lots of people. However, out of interest, how many, as a percentage-wise, I'm going to throw this open a little bit, how many of those do you think actually report to the police? Give me a percentage, just somebody throw a figure out there. 10%. 10%. Anybody else? 20. Okay, pretty good. Pretty good, actually. It's actually 16%, so we're actually in there somewhere. Brilliant. I'm probably talking to converted today. I ask that question sometimes, depending on the audience, delegates, people will say 50, 60%. The reality is only 16% of those cases are reported to the police. That may be for a variety of reasons. I'm certainly not going to judge why that is. I'm certainly not going to, it could be for that they live with the perpetrator, they rely on the perpetrator for a roof over their head. It could be that the perpetrator is a family member. However, the biggest reason is embarrassment. And I think the problem is we've still got a stigma in society attached to sexual assault and attached to sexual violence, that people don't want to report it, probably for fear of being judged. If you were burgled, you wouldn't have any question about picking the phone up and calling the police, would you? First thing you did, I've been burgled. However, when somebody is the victim of sexual abuse, they just don't feel as though they can pick the phone up and talk to the police. So it's embarrassment. We've still got that stigma. The second biggest reason is for fear of not being believed. Not necessarily by the police, but by the person who they're actually disclosing to or making the allegation to. And I think we've all got to play a part in that, is that if ever we do come across that, and obviously speaking to professionals, and I don't know where you all work, but there may be a chance that somebody may disclose to you, is that we've got a real onus on ourselves never to judge. We're never to think. Very often you hear, well, this is a quick quote to an organisation who I did some work with, well, what did you do to encourage it? And questions like that. I mean, what sort of question is that? What did you do to encourage it? Victim blaming. We've really got to get that out of society. Sexual abuse is 100% the fault of the perpetrator. It is never, ever the fault of the victim. We can use that word today. Also, another statistic. Sorry, I'm going to hit you with statistics to start with. Another statistic, 89% of those people who suffered from sexual abuse know the perpetrator. That's a massive figure. Again, it could be a family member, it could be a friend, it could be a colleague, it could be somebody they've known for years. Again, it could be a partner. But imagine the trauma that person must be going through. Not only have they suffered the sexual abuse or the sexual assault themselves, they've actually suffered it from somebody they probably know and trusted and have known for a long time. And that can add to the trauma massively. And again, that's something we often need to think about. Also, the amount of times, this is an interesting fact, I'm going to throw this one over actually as well. When we're talking about contact abuse, how many times do you think, as a percentage, the perpetrator is male? Can anybody give me a figure as a percentage? Talking contact abuse now. It's quite high, I'll tell you that. It's actually 98% of the time, which is a startling figure, I think. 98% of the time, the perpetrator is male when we're talking about contact abuse. Females are involved in sexual abuse, don't get me wrong, a lot of the grooming, certainly online and everything, but when we're talking literally about contact abuse. And the most likely group at the moment, this is according to the Crime Survey for England and Wales, to face sexual abuse and sexual harassment are actually students at the moment. So again, just throwing some statistics at you. I wanted to start with some statistics really, just to show you the prevalence of sexual assault and sexual abuse that is out there. Very often it is hidden. Very often, because doesn't get all reported, we don't actually know how often it happens. A definition of sexual abuse, or should I say sexual violence, there are lots of definitions out there. If you looked in the Sexual Offences Act 2003, you'll find some sort of definition. Good luck if you can make head and tail of that. It refers to a lot of subsections, etc. If ever, obviously, ever read Acts of Law, again, good luck with it. But the one I like to use is one used a lot by rape crisis centres, and what it says is any behaviour of a sexual nature which is unwanted and takes place without consent. And I think when you break that down a little bit, it sums it up quite well. Just look at that before I go on to talk about our organisation. Any behaviour of a sexual nature. So that's pretty easy to define, to be truthful. If we think about something of a sexual nature, I'm not going to go through it all today, but if you think about what deems sexual nature, then if it's any behaviour of a sexual nature, there are some grey areas you could include, like kissing, for example. So if two adults are in a relationship and are kissing for the point of arousal, then that's clearly of a sexual nature. However, if it's, and I'm taking it to the extreme here, if it's a grandparent kissing a grandchild goodbye after a weekend, then that's clearly not of a sexual nature. So there are some grey areas, but ultimately it's not difficult to define what is of a sexual nature. So that's the first part of definition. Any behaviour of sexual nature that is unwanted and takes place without consent. And this is the absolute key to it all, consent. Consent is pivotal to when we're talking about sexual abuse. Consent is defined as, well, you can give consent, I'm sorry I'm throwing definitions at your ear, if they agree by choice and have the capacity and freedom to make that choice. So again, thinking about that, it has to be a choice. Yes or no. So let's think about it in its simplest terms. Do you want to have sex? Yes. Easy, isn't it? Or do you want to have sex? No. Okay? Easy. However, it's not, because it then goes on to say that person must have the freedom and capacity to make the choice. I'll give you some examples. If somebody's intoxicated through drink or drugs, it doesn't have to be illegal drugs, could be prescription drugs sometimes as well. If they're intoxicated, then they haven't got the capacity to make a choice. If somebody is being blackmailed, if somebody is being threatened, if somebody fears for their own safety, if they fear for the safety of a loved one even, and an example I gave earlier, if they fear that if they say no, they will be kicked out of the house, they will have no means of living, then they haven't got the freedom to make the choice. So when we're thinking about consent, it's just not as easy as yes or no. And it has to be both. It can't be pick and mix. You can't say, yeah, I've got freedom, not the capacity, or I've got the capacity, I've got freedom. It has to be both. So I'm just going to take you back to the definition I just gave you earlier. Any behaviour of sexual nature that is unwanted and takes place without consent. So if that behaviour is of a sexual nature and consent has not been given, then we've crossed that line into sexual abuse. If we're talking to the police, they would then throw something back at me. Does anybody work for the police? No? Okay, it's good. So, but in its simplest terms, I mean, there are areas, and if you go to a court of law, you start to debate what consent is, etc. But in its simplest terms, that is a really good definition of sexual abuse. It takes place without consent, and it's of a sexual nature. And that's a good way of defining it. I work for an organisation called SV2. We support victims of sexual violence. So you've just heard me talk about the prevalence of it, you talk about how many it happens, and what the definition of. What we do, we are a commissioned service, we're based in Derbyshire, and we cover the whole of Derbyshire and Derby City. And what our role is that to support victims who have suffered from sexual violence, sexual assault, sexual abuse, both historical and recent as well. I'm sure you're all familiar with the term historical sexual abuse. Historical is something that's happened over 12 months ago, whereas anything within 12 months we class as recent. And the way that we support victims are in many ways, and for the next 5 minutes, talked too long, haven't I already? For the next 5 or 6 minutes, I'm just going to talk about how we support victims of sexual violence. First of all, we are commissioned to provide the county's SARC, that's the Sexual Assault Referral Centre. So if somebody has been raped or sexually assaulted within the last 7 to 10 days, then they will come to us, certainly if they report to the police, but we do have self-referrals as well, they will come to us for a forensic medical examination. And the purpose of that examination is to take samples, to get DNA, to get samples, in order to help with a possible police case going forward. That is one thing that we do, provide the SARC. It is open 24/7, 365 days a year, and we can mobilise within 1 hour. So if somebody reports to the police, we can have a crisis worker on site and a forensic nurse on site within 1 hour to conduct that medical service. Just talk you through a little bit about the process. if reported to the police, again, they will come within an hour. They will be met on site by a crisis worker. A crisis worker is there to advocate for that client through the whole time they're at the site through the forensic medical process. So what they will do, they will tell them what's happening, they will explain that they've still got a right choice in the matter. If they wanted to stop, they can, but effectively they're there to try as best they can to put that person at ease. You can imagine this person's already been through a trauma. The actually coming to the SARC is another trauma in itself. So that crisis worker is there to advocate for them the whole time. They will go through to a medical room, for want of a better word, where they will undergo the medical examination. That will be done by a specially trained forensic nurse. And then they'll be handed back, if you like, to the crisis worker to collect details, etc., etc. It may be after that there will be a police interview. It may be that they can go back for a police interview at another day. So that's one route to go through if somebody is reported to the police. We do offer self-referrals, so you don't have to report to the police. If you don't report to the police and you still come have exactly the same services are on offer, and we'll still carry out the medical. The difference is that we will then keep those samples on file. We can keep them on file for up to 2 years. So if that person changes their minds and decide they do want to go with a police prosecution, then we can then get the samples out and then send them away for testing. And so that's the two ways to go. Most of our clients at SV2, because we are commissioned, do come through the police, but we do take a lot of self-referrals as well. Other services that we run is an SV service and a CHISV service. That is an independent sexual violence advisor or a children's independent sexual violence advisor. And what they do, after the process of going through, that I've just talked about, the medical process, they'll be handed over to an ISVA. The ISVA will then act as the single point of contact for that person going forward, whether or not reported to the police. So it could be that the ISVA will then contact sexual health services, contact GPs, contact the courts if it's going through, certainly act as a point of contact with the police. It might even be housing, it might be benefits, all those sort of things that you think can make that, help that person in that situation. The ISVA will act as a single point of contact. And that ISVA will act for that person for quite a long time, and especially if it's a police case, it will act in the best interest of that person right the way through until the case has gone to court. And then finally, the other service that we offer is the counselling and therapy. So if you can imagine it as it's like a circle, if you like. The incident happens, they come to us for the examination, they then go through the process with the ISVA, and then it's all about trying to help the person deal with what's happened to them, trying to help them through the trauma. So we'll then move on to the counselling and therapy services that we offer. It could be that somebody just comes to us from a historical case that they might refer to us that they was abused 30 years ago, which certainly happens. Obviously then they won't need, there's nothing forensic to get from that, but the most likely then they'll enter in at that point through the trauma service. We don't for 1 minute say that we can make people better, but what we can do is help them deal with the trauma that they've gone through and help them sort of make sense of it all and hopefully help them lead a better life moving forward. So that's I've probably done about 13 minutes there, so I think I've just kept it under 15, looking at the clock. That is a whistle-stop tour of SV2 and what services we offer, and a little bit about sexual violence and the definitions. What I'd like you to take away really is the definition that I said earlier, because some people struggle with this, and certainly in courts of law a lot of barristers seem to struggle with this, especially the defence barristers. Nobody works as a barrister here or in a court of law, do they? Please say no, because you still get defences in law that try to say that the person was asking for it, that the person was wearing certain clothing, that the person had too much to drink. They still use that as a defence in courts of law sometimes. But you can think of that definition. Was the behaviour of a sexual nature, and did that person consent? And if it was, and they didn't, then it's sexual abuse. Okay. Thank you very much. That's my 15 minutes of fame. Has anybody got any questions?
Yeah, I do. So,
yes.
So I'm really interested in the capacity side of the consent.
Okay.
What if neither party has the capacity to be able to consent?
Good question. I always get this question. I go into schools delivering consent workshops, and they always try and look at the question to try and catch me out. So if neither, so let's take, I mean, obviously age comes into consent as well, which, I mean, I've not spoken about age. So let's say if, can I use age as an example? Say so the legal age of consent in this country is 16. There are variations. If somebody's in a position of trust, then it rises to 18. But effectively, it's 16. The law, however, is not there to prosecute two 15-year-olds who are taking part in mutually consensual sexual activity. So what we enter into then is there any form of exploitation? And what it is there effectively for is to stop exploitation. So in two people with haven't got the capacity, then we have to look at it a little differently. So it's not black or white. So we'll call on other services, people will get involved, etc. But in them cases, I can't give you a definitive answer because it's not black or white. Because clearly, let's take two people with learning difficulties. They may not have the capacity to consent in the true sense. Then you have to start questioning, do they actually know what they're doing? Do they know what they're doing is wrong? So there's lots and lots of questions that you have to go down there. So I'm afraid I can't give you a definitive answer to that, but it is something that then you will look into. Is that okay?
Yeah, perfect. I was thinking about people with learning disabilities.
Yeah.
I think importantly how we can support them to live the life that they lead, even though it might put them in risky situations. So.
Yeah, and again, the key words there, support into it. You know, it's about the support that we can give to certainly people with learning difficulties, certainly you know, young adults really with learning difficulties especially. Yeah. Anybody else? Okay.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much.